The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Logical Syllogisms. Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Some people are probably going to be expecting this to be like an introduction to Logic 101 or here's the basics of syllogisms. I'm going to be telling you details about syllogisms, but I don't want to get bogged down in it. There's countless videos out there and websites that'll go through in great detail and describe all the terms and give definitions and show all the rules that go into this. And I want to make sure that there's not graphics and words getting in the way. Because the purpose here today is to talk about the usefulness of syllogisms and how, for most of you, most of the time, it's going to be impractical. It's not something that you're going to have readily at your disposal unless you're working in logic all the time, unless you've taken courses and studied this. Not that it's hard, it's just something that actually takes practice. So I'm not going to be doing truth mapping, I'm not going to be pulling up Venn diagrams today, or probably any graphics at all. And yes, I know they can be helpful. I'm in part looking for some feedback from the people who watch these videos, and patrons in particular, to see if they would want me to go into a more detailed kind of Logic 101 thing, or if there's enough of that content out there and we want to keep things at a far more practical level. So you can always send your feedback in. I'm also going to have a couple of quick book recommendations. I believe both of these are textbooks. I'm pretty sure that this one is. This is a concise introduction to logic this is the 10th edition by Patrick J. Hurley. So the cover of yours may vary. These are used in universities as logic textbooks. Right there at the beginning is a square of oppositions. There's lots of good useful information here, and it starts with an introduction to sort of informal logic, the basic concepts, moves on to formal logic, then goes on to inductive, as well as addressing hypothetical logic and scientific reasoning. It's a really good kind of Logic 101, maybe even beyond that textbook, to give you the basics of everything you need to know if you're going to study logic. There are, though, additional books. One other one that I recommend for sure, this is Douglas Waltons' Informal Logic. And it takes a look at critical argumentation. It talks about how things are going to be worded, how to spot valid forms of an argument in more conversational settings. It's a pretty good, tune-up. Saying, hey, I'm going to be having these conversations and I'd like to make sure that I'm not making mistakes and I can identify problems. And so I'm going to go through a few things about syllogisms, and then I apologize, I'm going to kind of undermine all of it, because the truth is the overwhelming majority of people who watch this are not going to go out and study logic in detail. They're not going to learn how to construct syllogisms. They're not going to figure out which forms are valid and which forms are invalid. They're not going to get into philosophical conversations about soundness. What's going to happen is they're going to get in discussions with people and they want to spot fallacies. And curiously, because this video is about syllogisms and not specific fallacies, I'm not going to be listing a parade of fallacies either. Well, what are you going to do, Matt? Stay tuned. So I want to start by doing what everyone would kind of expect, and that is to say that if we're talking about a categorical syllogism, we're talking about two premises that lead to a conclusion. These premises can be in a variety of different forms. They are statements, not questions. That's an important thing, because if I ask a question, who murdered Bill? Well, there are many potential answers for that. But if I make a statement like, James murdered Bill, now I'm making a declarative statement that is either true or not true. This is what we're looking for in categorical syllogisms, is to address statements only, not questions. The broader argument could be viewed as a question, hey, does a God exist? Is it raining outside? Or what should I do next Wednesday? And you could probably construct a syllogism for any one of those. Whether or not it would be valid or sound is a second question. But you have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And your major premise has the major term as the predicate. So if you use the classic example, all men are mortals, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, this is a valid structure. It is such that mortal, all men are mortal, is the major term of the major premise. And in the second premise, Socrates is the minor premise, and men is the middle term. And so anytime you put a syllogism together, you need a major premise, a minor premise, or a major term, a minor term, and a middle term that connects those two. In this case, the thing that's connecting Socrates to mortality is the fact that Socrates is a man, or part of humanity. There are so many different ways that you can phrase a premise, though, that things can get lost. And as soon as you start adding negations and moving from universals to particulars, it can get very confusing. Because you could say all men are mortal, or you could say every creature that fits in the category that we identify as humanity has as one of its features necessarily mortality. And that would be a much longer way to do it. And often that's what we see, especially when we're trying to make sure that we are being as clear as possible, premises can get incredibly long. But as long as we're okay with what all men mean and what mortal means, we don't have to go through that. There are things that you can kind of assume from the structure and the context surrounding it of what we're talking about. But if there's ever a doubt, stop, because every premise can be pulled out and analyzed on its own. In addition to the major and minor terms, in the middle term, you have a conclusion, but what you have are types of statements. And so there are universal affirmatives or positives, like all men are mortal. That means everything that is a man is mortal. Then there are universal negatives, which would be no things that are men are mortal. And then you have particular statements, like some men are mortal, and some men are not mortal, etc. The traditional way to kind of identify these types of statements was to give them a vowel, A, E, I, O, and U, or A, E, I, and O. A being the universal affirmative, E being the universal negative, I being the specific affirmative, and O being the specific negative. That means that your argument can always be viewed as like an AAA structure or an AAI structure or an AEI structure, EOA, whatever. They're not all valid, though. There's 256 different ways that you can put together those four letters into the combination of three statements, two premises, and a conclusion. Of those 256 forms, only 24 are valid. And of those, only 15 are always valid. The other 9 are conditionally valid. And the only thing I'm going to say about conditional validity is that there is an entire subsection where we've determined that the best way to look at these things is to say they're conditionally valid based on the condition that the premise points to something that is real or exists. It is a subtle point that you can dig in on a later date, but at a minimum, we know that there are well over 200 forms, 200 different ways to put those statements together that result in an invalid syllogism. Now, I keep saying valid and invalid. What do I mean? It's really simple. If a syllogism is structured such that when the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true, it's a valid structure. It essentially means the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. If you said all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore peanuts taste good, well, that's what we would call a non sequitur. The conclusion has nothing to do with the premises. The major and minor premises aren't there. It seems as if we've just pulled this conclusion right out of thin air. So you can look at those things and say, okay, now we know that these particular structures are valid. So if I put together an argument that has this particular form of a universal positive leads to a universal positive conclusion, now I know that the structure is valid. Those variations across the premises and the three vowel sequences set what we would call the form. There's also the mood, there's standard form. All of these things are nitpicking minutiae that are incredibly important. I'm not trying to dismiss their value. They are what make logic work, but they're not something that everybody needs to understand immediately in order to figure out whether or not they have a good understanding or a basic understanding of logical arguments. So going through those, you might be thinking, hey, every time I have a conversation, my arguments and my opponent's arguments never are in a syllogistic form. So why are we spending time on this? And that's a great question, because it's true. We don't tend to think like that specifically. We think like it loosely. And we definitely don't speak in syllogisms by and large. It's one of the things that's frustrated some people about formal debates that we've done, is someone will stand up and say, here is my argument, premise 1, and then they'll go, and premise 2, and then they'll go, and then premise, then we go on, and you can have multiple premises. I'm talking, you can have premise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then you have, partial conclusions that are drawn from 2 and 3. We can reach this conclusion, and we'll call this 6, and then at the end we have a conclusion that ties everything together. Hang on, Matt, you said it was 2 premises and a conclusion. Yes. I know. This is one of the things that makes this so difficult for people, because you can have premises that lead to conclusions which become premises of other arguments. Kind of like a little Russian nesting doll type of thing. But when you know the structure, you'll be a lot better at identifying which arguments are flawed with respect to the validity. And validity is all about structure. It has nothing to do with content. Content is where we get to the issue of whether or not an argument is sound. And I realize that when you move out of categorical syllogisms and you move into informal logic, what you get is weak and strong arguments that are either cogent or uncogent. And that's a discussion for another time. But within the categorical propositional logic constructing a syllogism, it's validity and soundness. Validity goes to the argument structure. Soundness goes to whether or not the premises are true. Except, as you'll find, that's not actually the case. Or at least I have a slightly different way to address that. When we talk about whether or not an argument's sound, what you'll find if you go look it up in almost every place is an argument is sound if the structure is valid and the premises are true. And the one important change or clarification that I would make to that has nothing to do with logic itself. It has to do with reasonableness. And I think you'll see the point rather quickly. Whether or not the premises are actually true may be questionable. But what's important is, does the person accept that the premises are true? That may be the most critical aspect, because if you say, we'll stick with the one example so that nobody gets confused, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Boom. It may be the case that all men are not mortal, but as long as you accept that that premise is true, and you accept the second premise that Socrates is a man, you must accept the conclusion that therefore Socrates is mortal. Otherwise, you are being illogical, irrational, put whatever label on it you want, but we know that 2 true premises must necessarily lead to a true conclusion, and if you are rejecting the conclusion and accepting the premises, you are now engaged in flawed thinking. And what's worse is that it's at the point of the structure of the argument. And so what becomes important is, do they accept the premises? And this is incredibly useful. There's a particular form of argument called reductio ad absurdum, where you assume, for the sake of argument, a particular premise that may be dubious. And then you have a second premise, which is accepted, and then you get to a conclusion. If the conclusion is rejected, then that means that one of the 2 premises must be false, and if the second one is the one we've accepted, then the first premise must be false. If we're rejecting the conclusion, we must also at least reject that premise. If we say that we accept both the premises and reject the conclusion, well, now we're being irrational. This reductio ad absurdum takes a presumption, some God exists, follows it through a logical structure that leads to a conclusion, therefore there's no evil, that seems to contradict what we would assume from that. A great, mostly informal example is the Euthyphro Dilemma. And it addresses this notion of a God being all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. And so if God is all-powerful, why doesn't he stop evil? If God is all good, he would certainly want to stop evil. And if he's all-knowing, then he knows there's evil. So why is there evil? As long as we're accepting the conclusion that evil things happen, one or more of the premises in the Euthyphro Dilemma must be false. That's the power of this reductio ad absurdum argument as a tool to show that something we accept is wrong, even if we can't identify necessarily what it is. So when you're in informal conversation, it's important to remember that a flawed argument does not mean that the conclusion is false. If you have spotted a flaw, be it a structural flaw or a flawed premise, you still don't know that the conclusion is false. This is probably the sticking point that we get to more often than not on the TV show. When I point out that someone's reasoning is flawed, that they've reached a conclusion for bad reasons, what they seem to hear is, you are wrong about your conclusion. And that's not the case. Because if a structure is invalid, or a premise is unsound, then that puts us in a position where we have no idea what the truth value of the conclusion is. The point is, anyone who thinks they've demonstrated the conclusion is wrong. They have not demonstrated it. It could be the case, in the non sequitur example I used earlier, where all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore peanut butter tastes good. Well, the structure is completely invalid. But it appears that the premises are true, and the conclusion is something that we would generally accept as true. It's just that you cannot demonstrate that conclusion using those premises. So if somebody were to call in with something as absurd as that, I would say your argument is invalid. And because people don't understand the difference between validity and soundness, and because people tend to take things personally and assume that anytime you point out an error, that this means their conclusion is wrong, they can say, but peanut butter is good. And even if peanut butter were objectively good and everybody in the universe agreed that peanut butter were objectively good, their argument would still be invalid and would not in any way demonstrate that peanut butter is good. So when you get to the point where you have a good grounding in logical fallacies, in structure and syllogism, in looking at and making sure that you're not confusing contrary positions with contradictory positions. Contrary positions are those that are essentially mutually exclusive, but that could both be false. Contradictory positions are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. They cover the entire gamut. So all men are mortal, no men are mortal. One of those has to actually be true, right? All men are mortal or no men are mortal. It has to be one or the other. No, those actually contrary positions, because it could be the case that some men are mortal, in which case both all men are mortal and no men are mortal are now false. They're not exhaustive. But it can be the case that you can have contradictory positions in such that they're exhaustive, so that if you show that one is false, the other one must be true. There's a lot of detail to get in on that. It's something that you have to spend time practicing. And that's the thing that I kind of want to get to next. So let's say you're having a discussion with somebody and nobody's putting anything in syllogistic form because that's the way reality works. And you haven't actually gone through and spent a lot of time studying a book like Informal Logic, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. What do you do? Well, the nice thing is, usually you're not going to be in a situation where things are time sensitive. You can say, hang on a second, let me consider that and get back to you. Or if there's actually time at the table, let's draw this out. Learn the value of Venn diagrams, learn the value of putting things in a syllogistic form. But let's be honest, what happens most of the time is we'll hear an argument and say, gosh, something about that doesn't sound right. I can't put my finger on it because we already know that some arguments in informal form could be put into a variety of different formal versions that might show different fallacies. You might get a circular reasoning fallacy, affirming the consequent, denying the consequent, the middle term not distributed. All of these things that you would learn in studying logic, but they're hard to identify in an informal discussion sort of context. And we tend to ride our gut. This is what skepticism is about. This is what critical thinking is about. It is about training your intuitions and inferences so that when you first hear something, your BS detector goes off. You can do the same thing with logic, and you can have a conversation with somebody where they can put together something that's almost a syllogism but still informal, and your conclusion is, gosh, that sounds wrong, but I don't know why. And you need to be fair when you get to that point, which is to say, Maybe it sounds wrong to you because you have a bias. Maybe you don't like the conclusion that's there, and that's why things feel wrong to you, and why you're saying, oh, something's wrong with that argument, but I'm not sure what it is. Maybe you have a bias. Maybe there's a problem with a premise, but you can't quite put your finger on it because you don't have enough knowledge or information. You would need to go out and research to find out, is this premise true? Is it true that the murder rate has climbed 80% in the last 3 years, or whatever the factual assertion that they're making is? Maybe there's a structural problem. Maybe your intuitions are such that an argument is phrased in a way that's very similar to an argument form that you know is valid, but it's different. Something like, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. That kind of feels right to most people at the outset, in particular because it's very similar to an example that we know to be valid, and I would hope, all would recognize as sound. But when you look at that argument that all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man, what you find is that the premises are, the major premises listed twice, and the middle term isn't distributed across, and what you have is very difficult to pin down in a conversational sense. And then you might realize, oh, what if Socrates is the name of a dog? Now you have all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. But we know that that's not the case because Socrates could be a dog, and dogs are also mortal. And this is the problem with, you have a universal positive statement, all men are mortal, but that doesn't tell you what else is or isn't mortal. And that's why the term men and mortal are there, as mortal being the major term, and men being the middle term that connects with whatever you're doing. This is the sort of thing that takes practice, it takes understanding, but it's not magic and it's not hard. It just takes actual work that a lot of people aren't ready to do. But if you do the basic work, if you understand syllogisms, you can start to spot problems in conversation that you didn't even know were problems, and you don't even have to dig into why. Because there's some easy to spot rules about syllogisms. For example, if you have two negative premises, you can't reach a positive conclusion. Even though intuitively, perhaps with mathematics, oh, well, a negative times a negative is a positive. True, but a negative plus a negative is not necessarily a positive, or is never a positive. So you have contrary positions, contradictory positions, major premises, minor premises, middle terms, structure, all of these things, and it's just overwhelming, so why bother doing any of it? How do we deal with this stuff in reality? When we're having conversations with people, you don't always have time to pause. You don't always have time to try to put their argument in a syllogistic form, to check it for validity. And then if you do that and you find out it's valid, now you've got to start addressing soundness. It just seems like so much work. Tough. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but tough. The fact that there's a lot of work involved in potentially figuring out whether or not we're being reasonable, whether or not we are following the rational rules of logic. It's just the way it is. There's lots of things that are difficult, but that you're going to have to make the determination as to whether or not they're worth doing for you. This whole thing about soundness and true premises, and the notion that, oh, wait a minute, maybe we don't have access to truth. Well, to avoid that whole philosophical thing, that's why I mentioned the issue prior to this, that it's really about whether or not those premises are accepted. The biggest thing probably to take away, or a couple of the bigger things to take away, is the issue that if an argument is invalid or unsound, that doesn't tell you whether the conclusion is true or false. And that none of this is personal. Saying that you have a flawed argument isn't the same as saying you're stupid or you're uninformed or you're massively wrong. It means that you've made a mistake which all of us have made. I've been in live debates where a syllogism was presented that had an obvious, glaring fallacy, and I didn't spot that particular fallacy at the time. Instead, I identified another problem with the argument. And that's the nice thing. Because if you find any problem with the argument, if you find that it's an invalid structure, we're done. We don't have to consider that argument 1 second longer. We need a new version of that argument that is valid in structure. If you find that there's a premise that you don't accept, then I would argue we don't have to spend any time analyzing whether the structure is valid or not. Because as soon as we have a premise that isn't accepted, we already have a conclusion that is dubious, that we can accept or not accept. We can't accept it based on that particular argument. Now, one thing I'm interested in is whether or not this particular overview was helpful. I intentionally didn't put up any graphics or anything to distract, and I understand that there are people who are going to learn visually. But if we're going to dig in deep and go through a proper Logic 101 course, are there enough resources out there already for people? Do they think there's value in me going through some of this, perhaps with some novel examples and graphics? I am going to take a look at Venn diagrams and truth tables at some point, because I find them to be the single most useful way of addressing logical arguments. Just thinking in circles. Here's a circle that represents everything that's mortal, and there's a smaller circle within it that represents humanity. And so when we say all men are mortal, we're talking about this inner circle. Ooh, look, I'm doing graphics without graphics. We're talking about this inner circle within the realm of mortality. And then if we say Socrates is a man, that puts Socrates firmly as an individual component of that smaller circle, whereas the notion of Socrates as a dog puts it outside the circle of humanity, but still within the circle of mortality. And maybe Socrates is an abstract concept that sits outside of the frame of mortality and everything else. But if you want to go into detail in some of those, that's the type of things I'd be happy to do in small doses as an additional part of this project. But if you'd rather keep things at a more conversational level, I'd like to know that too. The one key to all of this is that it takes work. There are very few people who are likely to be able to walk into a room, hear an argument, and actually give a good reasoned explanation for what the problem of the argument is. As a matter of fact, I see plenty of people online spotting a flaw in an argument and then being wrong about what the actual flaw is, even though they are correct that the argument is either invalid or unsound. And it's because we live our lives by our gut instincts, our intuition, our inferences. And as long as we're doing that, we're going to make mistakes even when we're right. And the thing to remember is that the person who has spotted a flawed argument but got the flaw wrong is in pretty much the same position as the person who presented a flawed argument and did not spot it. Because if you say your argument's flawed and here's the reason, and they're able to show that your reason that their argument is flawed is itself flawed, well, now where are we? Does that mean the original argument isn't flawed? Clearly not. It just means that your response had no way of demonstrating what the flaw was. It's complicated. And in most cases, when we're having conversations, nobody goes anywhere near any of this stuff. I think it's incredibly important and valuable for people, especially those who are going to be arguing and debating, to have a good grounding in this. You don't have to become an expert. You don't have to be able to talk about subcontraries and various different, you don't have to know fallacies by name. You don't have to know arguments by name. Oh, that's modus ponens. That's modus tollens. And, that probably isn't going to do anything to help further the conversation. But having that understanding, especially if you can find a way to explain it to somebody else, especially if you get to the point where you can say, okay, let's take your argument and put it into this syllogistic form. Do you understand why? Because we know that this form here is valid. And so if your premises are true, your conclusion is true. And so if we put it in that structure, we can now test it. It's like having a carpenter's square. The rules of formal logic are there to serve as a way to verify our suspicions and intuitions. If you walked around my house and you found a corner and you said, oh, that's a nice square corner there. Well, you could be right, you could be wrong, but the carpenter's square is one way for us to check to see if that corner is actually square. And I find myself living in a world where it seems or feels even though this isn't accurate, that a bunch of people are standing around the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and some of them are going, wow, that is absolutely perpendicular with the ground, and some other people are standing around saying, nuh-uh, it's obviously tilted. And yet very few people understand that there's probably a dozen different ways that anybody could easily verify which of those two statements is true. A plumb bob, drop a rock, look at the shadow, put a carpenter square up at the base of it. Countless different ways to actually do this. And what's actually happening is people standing around just arguing about their perception of things without knowing that we have a way to test it. How frustrating is it to live in a world where people are like, oh, well, this thing showed vaccines cause autism, and I'll pay money to anybody who can show that, vaccines are actually safe, et cetera, blah, blah. When we have data, test data on those. The same thing is true for logic. We're not sitting around having great debates about math, which is derived from logic. We might have great debates about how mathematical models are being used to describe the origins of the universe or the structure of the universe. But by and large, if you've got a tool that can show you whether or not you're right, use it. And that's what the structured language of a formal, logical, categorical syllogism is. It's a way to make sure that you don't make the boneheaded mistakes. So now you can set aside the structure and focus on the content to determine whether or not you accept those premises, whether or not you accept the conclusion, whether or not we have good reason to think that we're engaged in an activity that makes us reasonable. You don't have to become an expert in everything about logic and learn all the forms and get the jargon down. I know people who study this stuff for a long period of time who are still going to constantly go back and reference other things. There's a reason I keep the books around. I don't spend all my time diagramming syllogisms and creating truth tables, because some of it's become second nature, and some of it I don't even know. Some of it I haven't studied well enough to know how to address that with other people, because by and large it doesn't affect the sort of conversations we have on a daily basis. So hopefully this has kind of given some of you, I hope it's encouraged you to go out and find out everything you can about syllogisms and logic and become an expert. Some of you, I hope that it's let you know that you don't have to do that in order to have a basic understanding and be able to train yourself to spot problems in conversational logic. And that's it for this time. I'll dig in a little bit more and wait for some feedback. Thank you to all the patrons. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.